In the labyrinthine depths beneath Vatican City, behind locked doors that few have ever passed through, there allegedly exists a room containing a device so extraordinary that its very existence challenges our understanding of reality. Not a religious artifact, not a forgotten treasure, but something far more improbable. A machine that peers through the veil of time itself. They call it the Chronovisor. Imagine the ability to witness any moment in history, not through reconstruction or reenactment, but through direct observation, as if watching a live broadcast from the past. The crucifixion of Christ, the building of the pyramids, the true face and voice of Julius Caesar, all accessible at the turn of a dial, the press of a button. This isn't science fiction. According to multiple sources with connections to the Vatican, this technology has existed since the 1950s, hidden from public knowledge for reasons that range from the protection of religious doctrine to concerns about catastrophic temporal paradoxes. The claim itself seems absurd, the stuff of pulp novels and B-movies. Yet the story of the Chronovisor originates not from conspiracy theorists or science fiction writers, but from a respected Franciscan priest with connections to the highest levels of Vatican hierarchy, Father Pellegrino Ernetti, before his death. In 1994, Father Ernetti, a renowned theologian, musicologist, and exorcist, revealed that he had been part of a secret team that created a device capable of viewing past events with perfect clarity. More shocking still, he claimed the project had received not just the blessing of the Vatican, but direct funding from its coffers. Why would the center of the Catholic faith invest in technology that sounds more at home in H.G. Wells than Holy Scripture? And if such a machine truly exists, why keep it hidden from the world? To understand the Chronovisor mystery, we must first travel back in time ourselves, not with a miraculous machine, but through historical record and testimony to Venice, Italy in the early 1950s, where a brilliant priest with an unusual combination of skills began an extraordinary journey into the unknown. But before we follow Father Ernetti down this rabbit hole, we must ask ourselves, in an age where the line between technological possibility and impossibility grows increasingly blurred, could the most fantastical technology of all be locked away in the world's smallest country, guarded by the oldest continuous institution on Earth? And if so, what have they seen? Venice, 1952. Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a 27-year-old Benedictine monk at the Abbey of San Giorgio Maggiore, sat hunched over an ancient musical manuscript. Unlike most priests, Ernetti wasn't merely a man of faith, he was also a scientist with specific expertise in archaic music and acoustics. His ability to decipher forgotten musical notations had already earned him a reputation as one of Europe's leading musicologists. But on this particular afternoon, Ernetti wasn't thinking about Gregorian chants or medieval compositions. His mind was consumed by a conversation he'd had the previous day with a brilliant, if controversial, physicist named Enrico Fermi. Fermi, one of the architects of the atomic age and winner of the 1938 Nobel Prize in Physics, had been visiting Venice for a conference. According to Ernetti's later accounts, the two men found themselves discussing an unusual phenomenon Ernetti had experienced while working with electronic equipment designed to analyze sound waves. While recording Gregorian chants, Ernetti would later explain, "I noticed something peculiar. Occasionally, among the voices of the current choir, we would pick up fragments of music and chanting that weren't present in the room, different voices. Ancient linguistic patterns using musical scales that hadn't been employed for centuries." Most scientists would have dismissed these anomalies as radio interference or equipment malfunction. Fermi did not. Instead, he allegedly proposed a radical theory. What if sound waves, like light, never truly dissipate but continue to exist in space? And time. What if, with the right technology, these acoustic fossils could be retrieved and reconstructed? This chance conversation supposedly sparked a collaboration that would grow to include several other prominent scientists and eventually lead to one of the most closely guarded secrets in Vatican history. The official record shows that Enrico Fermi was indeed in Italy during this period, having returned from America for lectures and family visits. What's less clear is whether this specific meeting with Ernetti ever took place. Fermi died of stomach cancer in 1954, making verification of his involvement difficult. Yet Ernetti was specific about other collaborators who joined their clandestine project. Among them, he named Werner von Braun, the former Nazi rocket scientist who later became a key figure in the American space program, and Father Agostino Gemelli, a psychologist who founded the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan and had close ties to Pope Pius XII. This unusual assembly of religious figures and cutting-edge scientists allegedly worked in secret for several years, driven by a shared vision to create a device that could capture and visualize residual electromagnetic radiation from past events, essentially, to build a window into history. By 1956, according to Ernetti, they had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The device they created resembled a large television with multiple antennae, cathode ray tubes, and dials for specifying precise temporal coordinates. It was, Ernetti claimed, capable of tuning into any place and time in human history, extracting both visual and audio information from the past with perfect clarity. If true, the implications were staggering. Historical uncertainties could be resolved with a glance. Religious claims could be verified or debunked. The entire field of archaeology could be transformed overnight. But here's where the story takes its most puzzling turn. Rather than announcing this world-changing invention to humanity, the team allegedly surrendered the device and all related research to the Vatican, which promptly classified everything under the highest levels of secrecy. Why would scientists of such caliber agree to hide what would undoubtedly be the most significant invention in human history? And why would the Vatican, an institution dedicated to preserving and promoting religious truth, take possession of a machine that could potentially provide irrefutable evidence for its core beliefs? As we'll discover, the answers may lie not in what the Chronovisor revealed about the past, but in what those revelations threatened to unravel in the present. The first detailed description of the Chronovisor came from Father Ernetti himself, revealed gradually through interviews, granted in the 1970s and 1980s. According to these accounts, the device stood approximately 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, resembling an oversized television console combined with elements of a pipe organ and an early computer. It contained 3 distinct components, Ernetti explained to Italian journalist Vincenzo Maddaloni in a 1972 interview. First, a series of antennae tuned to capture residual electromagnetic radiation. Second, a complex array of filters and signal processors to isolate the desired temporal and spatial coordinates. And third, a viewing screen where the captured images and sounds would be reproduced. The principle behind the machine, as Ernetti described it, was elegantly simple in concept, yet mind-bogglingly complex in execution. Every event in history, he claimed, leaves an indelible imprint on the fabric of space-time, a permanent electromagnetic signature that continues to echo throughout the universe. The Chronovisor was designed to detect, amplify, and translate these signatures into comprehensible sight and sound. Operating the device reportedly required extensive training. Temporal coordinates had to be precisely calibrated using multiple reference points, including astronomical alignments, geomagnetic readings, and mathematical constants. The slightest miscalculation could send the viewer hundreds of years away from the intended target. It was not unlike tuning a radio, Ernetti said, but with infinitely more variables. You had to find the exact frequency of the moment you wished to observe, then stabilize the connection long enough to record what you were seeing. This description, while fascinating, raises immediate scientific questions. Modern physics does recognize that information is never truly lost at principle formalized in quantum mechanics, but the idea that complete audio-visual records of past events remain accessible in any practical way contradicts our current understanding of how electromagnetic radiation behaves. Yet Ernetti insisted the technology worked and offered tantalizing details of historical events he claimed to have witnessed firsthand through the Chronovisor's screen. Most famously, he described watching Christ's crucifixion on Calvary, providing specific details about the positioning of the crosses, the behavior of the crowd, and even the Aramaic words spoken by Jesus that differed slightly from biblical accounts. He claimed to have observed Napoleon, ancient Roman Senate proceedings, and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But perhaps most convincingly, Ernetti claimed the team had used the Chronovisor to witness a performance of Thyestes, a lost tragedy written by Quintus Ennius in the 2nd century BCE, of which only fragments had survived into the modern era. Not only did Ernetti claim to have watched the performance, but he also said he had transcribed part of the text directly from the Chronovisor's audio capture dot. In 1972, he produced this transcription, 169 Latin words purportedly copied directly from the lost play as it was performed over 2,000 years ago. Classical scholars were intrigued but skeptical. The text seemed authentic in style and meter, but without the original for comparison, verification was impossible. Further controversy erupted when Ernetti produced what he claimed was a Chronovisor photograph showing the face of Christ during his agony on the cross. The black and white image, published in the Italian magazine La Domenica del Corriere in May 1972, showed a bearded man with his eyes closed, apparently in pain. These artifacts, the Thyestes fragment and the Christ photograph, represent the only physical evidence ever presented to support the Chronovisor's existence. As we'll see, both would eventually become the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. But the most pressing question remained unanswered. If such a revolutionary device had been created, Why keep it secret? According to Ernetti, this decision came directly from the highest levels of Vatican authority, including Pope Pius XII himself. After witnessing what the machine could do, Ernetti claimed, His Holiness became deeply concerned about its potential for misuse. He said to me, "This device could change the course of human history, but it could also destroy it. Some doors are better left closed." Whether these were truly the words of Pius XII or simply Ernetti's attempt to explain the inexplicable disappearance of world-changing technology, we may never know for certain. But as evidence and counter-evidence accumulated around the Chronovisor claims, the story would only grow more complex and more compelling. The Vatican's relationship with science has always been more nuanced than popular narratives suggest. While conflicts like the Galileo affair loom large in public consciousness, the Catholic Church has also been a significant patron of scientific research throughout history, establishing observatories, universities, and research institutions. By the mid-20th century, when the Chronovisor was allegedly developed, Pope Pius XII had actively worked to reconcile Catholic doctrine with modern scientific advances, including the Big Bang Theory, which he saw as compatible with the concept of divine creation. This context makes the Vatican's purported interest in the Chronovisor somewhat more plausible. A device that could potentially verify historical aspects of Christianity would have obvious appeal to church authorities, assuming, of course, they were confident in what such verification would reveal. According to Francois Brune, a French priest and theologian who became the primary chronicler of the Chronovisor story after extensive interviews with Ernetti, the Vatican's involvement went far beyond mere interest. In his 2002 book, Les Nouveaux Mystères du Vatican, Brune claimed that the Holy See not only funded the project but provided secure facilities within Vatican City for the team's later experiments. The operation was conducted under the utmost secrecy. Brune wrote, "Fewer than 20 people within the Vatican hierarchy were aware of its existence, and all materials related to the project were stored in archives accessible only to those with the highest security clearance." If Brune's account is accurate, the Chronovisor project would represent one of the most closely guarded secrets in Vatican history, comparable to the so-called Third Secret of Fatima, or the contents of the Vatican secret archive's most restricted collections. But what evidence exists to support this extraordinary claim of Vatican involvement? First, there's the undisputed fact that Father Ernetti was a respected Vatican insider with legitimate connections to the hierarchy. As a consultant to the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly known as the Holy Office, or Inquisition, and a renowned exorcist authorized by the Church, Ernetti had access to circles of power within the Vatican that would have been closed to ordinary priests. Second, several high-ranking church officials never directly denied the Chronovisor claims when questioned. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, who served as pro-prefect of the Sacred Congregation during the alleged development period, reportedly responded to a journalist's inquiry about the device with a cryptic, "We have many things we keep to ourselves." Third, there's the curious fact that in 1988, the Vatican issued an unprecedented decree in the official Osservatore Romano newspaper explicitly prohibiting Catholics from attempting to build time-viewing or time-traveling devices, citing grave risks to the faith and to the unity of the Church. This decree, issued without context or explanation, struck many observers as oddly specific, as if addressing a real concern rather than a hypothetical one. However, concrete documentation of Vatican involvement in a Chronovisor project remains elusive. No budget allocations, personnel assignments, or official communications regarding such a device have ever been discovered inaccessible. Church records dot when directly questioned about the Chronovisor in 1996. 2 years after Anetti's death, Vatican spokesman Joaquin Navarro-Valls issued a terse statement. The Holy See has never possessed or currently possesses a device known as the Chronovisor. Claims to the contrary are without foundation. This carefully worded denial leaves room for interpretation. Note that it specifically denies possession of a device known as the Chronovisor, not necessarily the existence of time-viewing technology under a different name or classification. Some researchers have suggested that if the Vatican did indeed possess such technology, it would likely be controlled by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, an independent entity within Vatican City that conducts research in various scientific fields. Founded in 1936, the Academy operates with considerable autonomy and includes non-Catholic scientists among its members. Another possibility is that the device, if real, might be housed within the Vatican Secret Archives, recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive, which contains millions of documents spanning more than 12 centuries of history. Despite limited access granted to qualified researchers in recent decades, vast portions of the archives remain unexplored by outside scholars. What's certain is that the Vatican would have compelling reasons to maintain secrecy around such technology if it existed. A device capable of witnessing past events could potentially verify or contradict core historical claims of Christianity, from the resurrection to the authenticity of relics and the accuracy of biblical accounts. As one anonymous Vatican source allegedly told journalist Peter Krasa. Some truths are meant to be accepted on faith alone. To prove them through technological means would undermine the very foundation of religious belief. Whether this represents genuine Vatican philosophy or convenient justification for hiding potentially disruptive technology remains one of the central questions in the Chronovisor mystery, a question that leads us deeper into the shadowy intersection of science, faith, and power. To evaluate the Chronovisor claims objectively, we must confront a fundamental question. Could such a device actually work according to known scientific principles, or does it require us to abandon our current understanding of physics? The core concept behind the Chronovisor that past events leave persistent. Electromagnetic signatures that can be detected and reconstructed initially seems to contradict established science. After all, light and other electromagnetic radiation disperse over time and distance, becoming effectively impossible to reconstitute after traveling even relatively short cosmic distances. However, several theoretical frameworks might offer at least partial support for the possibility of time-viewing technology. The first comes from quantum physics. According to the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory, developed by John Wheeler and Richard Feynman in the 1940s, electromagnetic radiation can be understood as traveling both forward and backward in time. This time-symmetric interpretation of electromagnetism suggests that information about past events might be recoverable through properly designed quantum mechanical systems. Another relevant concept is quantum entanglement, wherein particles that interact become connected such that the quantum state of each particle cannot be described independently. In theory, entangled particles maintain their connection regardless of distance or potentially time. Some physicists have proposed that this spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it, might allow for information to be exchanged across temporal boundaries. Perhaps most intriguingly, recent advances in quantum computing have demonstrated that, under certain conditions, information that appears to be lost can actually be recovered through carefully designed quantum algorithms. This principle of quantum error correction suggests that information may be more persistent and recoverable than classical physics would indicate. Dr. David Deutsch of Oxford University, a pioneer in quantum computing, offers a perspective that seems relevant to the Chronovisor concept. Quantum computation does literally involve a vast number of parallel computations taking place in parallel universes. In theory, a sufficiently advanced quantum system might access information states from what we perceive as the past. While these theoretical frameworks don't provide a clear path to building a time-viewing device, they do suggest that our intuitive understanding of time and information as strictly linear and degradable may be incomplete, moving from pure theory to applied technology. Several modern scientific endeavors bear at least superficial similarities to what Ernetti described. In the field of archaeoacoustics, researchers have attempted to recover sound from the distant past by analyzing microscopic patterns in pottery, created while the clay was still soft and potentially capturing ambient sound vibrations. In 2006, archaeologists claimed to have recovered snippets of sound from 6,500-year-old pottery, including what appeared to be human voice patterns, though these claims remain highly contested. Similarly, the field of gravitational wave astronomy, which detected its first confirmed signals in 2015, demonstrates that extremely subtle disturbances in space-time can be detected with sufficient technological sophistication. While gravitational waves don't directly record past events, they do represent a form of information propagation that was once thought impossible to detect. Perhaps most relevant is the development of quantum archaeology, a theoretical approach that proposes using quantum computing to reconstruct past events by analyzing their persistent effects on the present. While still largely conceptual, this field suggests pathways by which information about the past might be recovered through sufficiently advanced technology. Dr. Eleanor Hammond, a quantum physicist at CERN who has studied the Chronovisor claims, offers this assessment. While we can't categorically state that such a device is impossible, according to known physics, building one would require technological capabilities far beyond our current reach. If the Chronovisor existed as described by Ernetti, it would represent a quantum leap in scientific understanding that makes the Manhattan Project look like a high school science experiment. Indeed, the technology described by Ernetti would have been particularly extraordinary for the 1950s, when vacuum tubes still dominated electronics and the integrated circuit had not yet been invented. The computational power required to process and reconstruct complete audio-visual information from degraded electromagnetic Signals would exceed even modern supercomputers. However, it's worth noting that many scientific breakthroughs have emerged from classified military or intelligence programs years or decades before becoming public knowledge. The Internet, GPS, and stealth technology all existed as classified projects long before their public unveiling. Could a similar classified breakthrough in quantum information processing have enabled the creation of a proto-chronovisor in the 1950s? While highly improbable, it cannot be categorically dismissed if we accept the possibility of significant compartmentalized scientific advances. What we can say with certainty is that if the chronovisor functioned as described by Ernetti, it would require either a fundamental revision of our understanding of physics and information theory technology, so far beyond the public state of the art as to be indistinguishable from magic access to scientific principles discovered through means outside conventional research paths, as we'll see in the next chapter. These considerations become crucial when examining the evidence and counter-evidence for the chronovisor's existence. The case for the chronovisor's existence rests primarily on testimony, and 2. Physical artifacts hardly the robust evidence one might expect for such an extraordinary claim. Yet these elements have generated decades of debate and investigation. Let's examine each piece of evidence critically. First and foremost is the testimony of Father Pellegrino Ernetti himself. By all accounts, Ernetti was a serious academic and respected clergyman, not prone to flights of fancy or attention-seeking behavior. His credentials in musicology were legitimate, and his standing within the church was substantial. He maintained his claims about the chronovisor consistently from the 1970s until his death in 1994, adding details but never contradicting his core narrative. "I saw Christ dying on the cross," he told Italian newspaper La Domenica del Corriere in 1972. "I saw everything. The agony, the crowd spitting, the soldiers gambling for his clothes. Even from a distance of almost 2,000 years, his passion moved me profoundly." When pressed for technical details about the device, Ernetti provided consistent and scientifically plausible descriptions, at least to the extent that any time-viewing technology could be considered plausible. His accounts included specific limitations of the device, such as its inability to view events before the appearance of humans, which he attributed to the absence of conscious observers, and difficulties maintaining temporal focus for extended periods. These nuanced limitations actually lend some credibility to his claims. A pure fabricator might have described a perfect device without such constraints. Similarly, his insistence that the technology had been surrendered to Vatican authorities rather than remaining in his possession suggests a narrative more complex than simple self-aggrandizement. Supporting Ernetti's testimony was Father Francois Brune, who conducted extensive interviews with Ernetti and became the primary chronicler of the chronovisor story. Brune's 2002 book, Les Nouveaux Mystères du Vatican, expanded on Ernetti's claims, adding details about the Vatican's involvement and the ultimate fate of the device. As a theologian with doctoral degrees in both philosophy and literature, Brune brought academic credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as fringe speculation. Beyond personal testimony, however, the physical evidence for the chronovisor is limited to 2 artifacts: The Thyestes fragment and the photograph of Christ. The Thyestes fragment initially seemed the more compelling of the two. Quintus Ennius was a real Roman poet whose works survive only in fragments, and his lost tragedy, Thyestes, was known to have existed through references in other classical texts. The 169-word Latin text produced by Ernetti appeared stylistically consistent with Ennius's known work and employed authentic archaic Latin forms. However, in 1996, shortly after Ernetti's death, classical philologist Catherine Owen Eldred published an analysis demonstrating that the supposed Thyestes fragment was actually a mosaic of quotations from existing Latin texts, primarily Seneca's own version of Thyestes written centuries after Ennius. The text also contained several grammatical anachronisms, inconsistent with Ennius's era. This discovery dealt a serious blow to Ernetti's credibility. If the Thyestes fragment was fabricated, what about his other claims? The photograph of Christ, published alongside Ernetti's initial interviews, faced even swifter debunking. Art historians quickly identified it as a reversed image of a wooden crucifix sculpture by Spanish artist Collet Valera, displayed in the Sanctuary of Merciful Love in Collevalenza, Italy. The resemblance was unmistakable, down to specific details of the beard and facial expression. When confronted with these discrepancies, Ernetti offered no substantive defense of the photograph, but insisted that the Thyestes text was genuine. Father Brun later suggested that Ernetti may have been pressured to provide physical evidence by journalists and had fabricated these artifacts to protect the real. Chronovisor technology from exposure. The real photographs and recordings were under Vatican seal, Brun claimed in a 2007 interview. Ernetti created substitutes to satisfy public curiosity while honoring his vow of secrecy regarding the actual technology. This explanation strikes many as convenient a way to maintain the core Chronovisor claim while accounting for the demonstrated falsity of the only physical evidence. Yet it does align with one intriguing account that emerged after Ernetti's death. In 2003, an anonymous letter was sent to Father Brun, purportedly from a relative of Ernetti, who had attended his deathbed. According to this account, Ernetti had made a partial confession in his final hours. Father Ernetti admitted that the photo of Christ was a fake, and that he had composed the Thyestes text himself based on his knowledge of Latin and classical literature. However, he insisted that these fabrications were created only because he had been forbidden from revealing the true evidence obtained through the Chronovisor, which remained under Vatican seal. If accurate, this deathbed statement presents a complex picture. A man who lied about specific evidence but maintained, until his final moments, that the core technology was real. The controversy deepened. In 2007, when researcher Peter Krasa uncovered an intriguing document in the archives of the University of Bologna, a research proposal submitted in 1952 by Father Agostino Gemelli, one of Ernetti's alleged collaborators, requesting funding for a project described as an electromagnetic device for the capture and analysis of historical optical and acoustic phenomena. The proposal was rejected as speculative and beyond current technological capabilities, but its mere existence suggests that at least the concept of a time-viewing device was being seriously considered by credentialed scientists connected to the Vatican during the exact period Ernetti claimed the Chronovisor was being developed. Further circumstantial evidence comes from the careers of Ernetti's alleged collaborators. Several, including Werner von Braun and Enrico Fermi, had documented connections to classified scientific projects during this period. Von Braun, in particular, was working on advanced guidance systems for rockets that incorporated principles of electromagnetic wave propagation similar to those Ernetti described in the Chronovisor. Yet no blueprint, photograph, or technical document showing the actual Chronovisor has ever surfaced. No other direct participant in the project has confirmed its existence. The device itself, if it ever existed, remains hidden or perhaps dismantled within the secretive confines of Vatican. City. As investigative journalist David Center observed, we're left with a perfect information vacuum. The only physical evidence has been debunked, yet the core claim remains tantalizingly difficult to dismiss entirely. Either Ernetti perpetrated an elaborate hoax that he maintained until his death, or he revealed a genuine secret but muddied the waters with fabricated evidence when pressed to provide proof he couldn't actually access. The truth seemed poised to remain in this ambiguous state until 2010, when a discovery in the recently opened portions of the Vatican archives cast the entire mystery in a startling new light. Retry B. In April 2010, Pope Benedict XVI authorized the opening of previously restricted sections of the Vatican secret archives from the papacy of Pius XII, 1939 to 1958. This unprecedented access allowed qualified researchers to examine documents that had remained sealed for over half a century. Among them was Dr. Isabella Rossi, a historian specializing in the intersection of science and Catholicism during the 20th century. What she discovered sent shockwaves through both academic circles and the community of Chronovisor researchers. I was examining budget allocations for scientific initiatives under Pius XII, Rossi later wrote in the Journal of Vatican Studies. Most were routine observatory maintenance, medical research grants, archaeological expeditions. But in a ledger from 1955, I found an unusual entry, a substantial allocation of funds for something called Progetto Chronovision, authorized directly by the Pope himself. The amount equivalent to approximately $2.1 million in today's currency had been transferred to an account managed by Father Agostino Gemelli, one of the very scientists Ernetti had named as a collaborator on the Chronovisor project. More intriguingly, the allocation was classified under Extraordinary Research Initiatives, with a security designation found on few other Vatican documents from the period. This financial record represented the first documentary evidence that something called Chronovision existed beyond Ernetti's claims, and that it had received significant Vatican funding during exactly the period he had specified. Further searching revealed additional documents, requisition orders for specialized electronic components from Switzerland and Germany, travel authorizations for Father Gemelli to meet with scientists, including Enrico Fermi, in 1952, and a cryptic internal memo from Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, mentioning unprecedented observational capabilities with significant theological implications. None of these documents explicitly confirm the existence of a functioning time-viewing device, but collectively they established that some project bearing the name Chronovisor had indeed existed had received substantial Vatican resources and had involved precisely the individuals Ernetti had identified. Most tantalizing was a single sheet of paper found in a file of correspondence between Pope Pius XII and Cardinal Ottaviani, dated September 17, 1956, just weeks after Ernetti claimed the first successful Chronovisor test. The handwritten note from the Pope contained a single sentence: "What we have witnessed changes everything and nothing." When Rossi's findings were published in 2012, the Vatican press office issued a terse statement. Projects undertaken during the scientific initiatives of Pope Pius XI's papacy covered many experimental areas. Documentation regarding these projects does not verify claims about technologies beyond the scientific understanding of that period. This carefully worded response neither confirmed nor denied the existence of a Chronovisor project. It merely asserted that documentation didn't prove technologies beyond scientific understanding. Critics quickly noted that this statement itself represented a significant shift from earlier blanket denials. Father Thomas Weinandy, a consultant to the Vatican's International Theological Commission, offered a more nuanced perspective. The Church has always been interested in scientific advancement, including areas that might intersect with spiritual and historical questions. That interest doesn't necessarily validate specific claims about what technologies were developed or deployed. For Chronovisor researchers, however, Rossi's discoveries represented vindication. We now have documentary proof that the Vatican funded something called Chronovision, involving the exact people Ernetti named, noted Peter Krasa. This transforms the debate from whether Ernetti was fabricating the entire story to whether the technology actually worked as he described. The significance of these archival discoveries extends beyond mere validation of a name or budget line. They establish a crucial point. Whatever Progetto Chronovision entailed, it was serious enough to warrant significant funding, high-level security, and the direct attention of the Pope himself. But the archives also raised new questions. Why did the project apparently end so abruptly? The financial records showed steady funding through 1956 and early 1957. Then nothing, no formal termination, no final reports, simply a cessation of all documented activity. It's as if the project either achieved its goal and was moved elsewhere, or encountered some catastrophic failure that necessitated immediate shutdown, observed Rossi. Neither scenario is documented in the accessible archives. More intriguing still was a directive found in Cardinal Ottaviani's papers from March 1957, ordering the transfer of unspecified sensitive materials from the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to a facility beneath the Vatican Library designated only as Archivum Secretum Omega. This location does not appear on any public map of Vatican facilities. When asked about it during a 2013 press conference, Vatican librarian Archbishop Jean-Louis Brugge stated simply, "The Vatican contains many specialized archival spaces, not all of which are active or accessible. Without specific context, I cannot comment on particular designations that may appear in historical documents. What happened in early 1957 that might have precipitated the apparent termination of the Chronovisor project? And what exactly did Pope Pius XII mean when he wrote that what they had witnessed changes everything and nothing? The answers may lie in what Anetti claimed to have seen through the device observations that, if true, would indeed change our understanding of history, while perhaps leaving the core spiritual truths of Christianity intact to fully appreciate. These claims we must examine not just what Ernetti and others allegedly witnessed through the chronovisor, but how these observations aligned with or contradicted established historical and religious narratives. If we accept for the moment that the chronovisor existed as described, what did those who operated it actually see? According to accounts from Anetti and others who claimed knowledge of the project, the device was used to observe numerous historical events of profound significance. The most famous and controversial observation was reportedly of the crucifixion itself. Ernetti claimed to have witnessed Christ's death on Calvary in extraordinary detail, providing specific observations about the arrangement of the crosses, not in a straight line as typically depicted in art, but in a triangle, the composition of the crowd, which included many more women than traditional accounts suggest, and even the exact words spoken by Jesus. His words were in Aramaic, of course, Ernetti told Father Brun, and differed somewhat from the gospel accounts, not contradicting them in essence, but with variations in specific phrasing that suggested the gospel writers had relied on memory and oral tradition rather than verbatim recording. This observation that the literal words differed while the meaning remained consistent aligns with Pius XII's cryptic note that what we have witnessed changes everything and nothing. If the chronovisor revealed minor historical discrepancies, while confirming the essential truth of biblical events, it would indeed represent both revolutionary change in historical understanding and fundamental continuity in theological meaning. Beyond the crucifixion, Ernetti claimed the team had observed numerous other biblical scenes, including Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, the construction of the Tower of Babel, and several of Jesus' sermons and miracles. In each case, he reported that the events had occurred essentially as described in Scripture, though often with contextual details absent from the biblical text. We saw that Moses received the commandments during a violent electrical storm. Ernetti reportedly told a colleague, "The tablets appeared to be made of a dark volcanic stone, not the white marble often depicted in art, and the burning bush that was something extraordinary, a phenomenon I still cannot explain in scientific terms." These biblical observations, while fascinating, would be nearly impossible to verify independently. More intriguing from a historical verification standpoint were the team's alleged observations of secular events from antiquity. According to both Ernetti and secondary sources, the chronovisor was used to witness scenes including a performance of Quintus Ennius's Lost Tragedy, Thyestes at a Roman theater in 169, BCE, a speech by Cicero before the Roman Senate in 63 BCE, Napoleon's planning sessions before the Battle of Waterloo, ancient construction techniques used in building the pyramids at Giza, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which Ernetti claimed was caused by a localized meteorite impact. The potential historical value of such observations would be incalculable. Entire academic fields could be transformed by direct observation of ancient events rather than reconstruction through archaeological evidence in fragmentary texts. Yet here we encounter a puzzling aspect of the Chronovisor story. If the device could provide such revolutionary historical insights, why did the Vatican allegedly restrict its use and ultimately dismantle or conceal it? According to Father Brune, the answer lies in what happened during a series of observations conducted in late 1956 and early 1957, precisely when the archival record shows the project's abrupt termination. The team had begun exploring alternative historical interpretations of key events. Brune wrote, based on his conversations with Ernetti. They observed moments where official historical narratives diverged significantly from what actually occurred. 1. Such divergence allegedly involved the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the critical assembly of bishops that established core Christian doctrines including the divinity of Christ. According to Brune, the Chronovisor revealed that certain critical votes at the council were influenced by political pressure from Emperor Constantine rather than theological consensus, and that some doctrinal positions attributed to the council were actually formalized decades later. This created immediate tension within the observation team, Brune reported. Those with scientific backgrounds viewed these discoveries as valuable historical clarifications. Those with deeper ties to church hierarchy saw potential threats to ecclesiastical authority. Another controversial observation reportedly involved the early papal succession. Traditional Catholic doctrine holds that Saint Peter was the first pope, followed by an unbroken line of succession to the present day. However, the Chronovisor allegedly showed that early church governance was more collegial than hierarchical, with leadership shared among several apostles rather than concentrated in a single papal authority. These observations, if made public, would not necessarily undermine core Christian theological claims about Jesus' divinity or resurrection. They would, however, challenge the historical basis for certain aspects of church structure and authority, potentially explosive information for an institution that grounds its legitimacy partially in historical continuity from the apostolic age. Most controversial of all were observations allegedly made of prehistoric human development. According to an anonymous source cited by Peter Krasa, the Chronovisor team observed evidence that human consciousness had developed through a process more complex than either pure Darwinian evolution or special divine creation as literally described in Genesis. They saw something that could be interpreted as guided evolution, this source claimed. A process that was neither purely natural selection nor instant creation, something that would satisfy neither strict creationists nor materialist scientists. If true, such observations might explain Pope Pius XII's cryptic comment that what they witnessed changes everything and nothing. The fundamental theological claim that humanity's development involved divine purpose could remain intact. While the specific mechanism might differ from traditional interpretations of Genesis. Were these controversial observations the reason for the project's apparent termination in early 1957? The timing certainly suggests a correlation. What's clear from the archival evidence is that something prompted an abrupt cessation of documented activity, followed by the transfer of materials to a highly restricted facility. But there's another possibility, one suggested by later developments and testimonies that emerged decades after Ernetti's initial revelations. that the Chronovisor project didn't end in 1957 at all, but rather transformed into something even more closely guarded, with implications extending far beyond historical observation. Asterisk. The conventional narrative of the Chronovisor, based primarily on Ernetti's public statements, presents it as a purely observational technology, a window into the past that allowed viewing, but not interaction. However, testimonies that emerged after Ernetti's death suggest the device's capabilities may have evolved far beyond passive observation. In 2005, a man identifying himself only as Lorenzo approached investigative journalist Maria Pia Beltran with an extraordinary claim. He stated that he had worked as a technical assistant at the Vatican between 1967 and 1984, during which time he had witnessed multiple demonstrations of what he called the advanced Chronovisor system, installed in a sub-basement facility beneath the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. The device I saw was much more sophisticated than what Father Ernetti described publicly, Lorenzo claimed. It wasn't just a viewing screen with antenna. It occupied an entire room with components embedded in the walls and ceiling, creating what the scientists called a temporal field throughout the chamber. According to Lorenzo, this advanced system didn't merely capture and display electromagnetic residue from the past. It actually created a controlled distortion in the fabric of space-time, allowing for what he described as partial material interface with temporal displacement zones. In simpler terms, limited physical interaction with the past. They could extract small objects, he claimed. Nothing living, nothing larger than perhaps 10 centimeters in diameter. But they could retrieve physical artifacts from historical periods and bring them into the present. This claim represents a quantum leap beyond Ernetti's public descriptions of the Chronovisor. If true, it would mean that technology had advanced from observation to actual retrieval, a development with profound implications for both science and security. Lorenzo's account, while extraordinary, included verifiable details about Vatican facilities and personnel that suggested genuine insider knowledge. He correctly identified obscure Vatican staff members and described architectural features of restricted areas, later confirmed by authorized visitors. When pressed for evidence of his temporal retrieval claims, however, he stated that all such activities were conducted under strict protocols that prevented any artifacts from leaving the facility. Everything retrieved was cataloged, studied, within the secure zone, and then stored in lead-lined vaults, he claimed. Nothing was permitted to leave the temporal research area due to concerns about potential contamination and paradox effects. Similar claims emerged from an unexpected source in 2008, when Cardinal Alfredo Bertello, a retired Vatican diplomat, made a series of ambiguous statements during an interview with Italian newspaper La Repubblica. When asked about scientific research conducted by the Holy See, Bertello remarked, "The Church has always been interested in understanding the fundamental nature of God's creation, including dimensions beyond ordinary human perception. Some research initiatives from previous decades explored aspects of physical reality that mainstream science is only now beginning to approach theoretically." When pressed specifically about the Chronovisor rumors, Bertello smiled and said, "I cannot comment on specific projects, but I will say that our understanding of time is still primitive. St. Augustine wrote that time is a creation of God, and like any aspect of creation, it can be studied and perhaps, to a limited extent, influenced through proper application of knowledge. The interviewer noted that Bertello emphasized the word influenced in a manner that seemed deliberately significant. When asked to clarify, the Cardinal declined further comment. These suggestions of expanded chronovisor capabilities align with theoretical work conducted by physicist David Deutsch, who has demonstrated mathematically that any system capable of viewing the past must, by the laws of quantum mechanics, create a potential pathway for information to travel in both directions. In other words, true observation of the past would necessarily create a theoretical possibility of interaction with it. However, such interaction would raise profound questions about causality and paradox. If objects could be retrieved from the past, couldn't their removal alter the timeline? And if the timeline could be altered, wouldn't that create potential paradoxes that might destabilize reality itself? According to temporal physics theorist Dr. Elise Montague, these concerns might explain the extreme secrecy surrounding the project. If the Vatican actually developed technology that could interact with the past, even in limited ways, they would face not just theological questions, but existential ones. The potential for catastrophic paradox would make nuclear weapons look like children's toys by comparison. This perspective might explain the alleged decision to not merely classify the technology but actively dismantle or deeply conceal it. The risks of misuse, whether deliberate or accidental, would far outweigh any potential benefits if the device truly could influence rather than merely observe the past. Yet another dimension of the story emerged in 2013 when documents declassified from the Central Intelligence Agency revealed that U.S. intelligence had maintained an active interest in the Chronovisor rumors since at least the early 1960 South. A heavily redacted 1964 CIA assessment titled Potential Breakthrough Technologies under Development by Foreign Powers included a section on temporal observation research at the Vatican. While most details were blacked out, one unredacted paragraph stated, sources indicate that experiments conducted between 1957 1961 may have achieved limited success in redacted. The technology has apparently been placed under the highest level of restriction by Vatican authorities. Assessment of potential strategic implications critical. This CIA interest suggests that U.S. intelligence took the Chronovisor claims seriously enough to monitor them as a potential strategic concern, not the typical response to what they believed was merely a religious hoax or misunderstanding. More disturbing still was a claim made by Lorenzo regarding the ultimate fate of those most closely involved with the advanced Chronovisor project. By the mid-1980s, all but two of the original team members had died under unusual circumstances. Father Ernetti was one of the few survivors, and he had been effectively isolated within the monastic community at San Giorgio Maggiore, with strict limitations on his communications. While this claim is difficult to verify definitively, public records do show that several scientists allegedly associated with the project died relatively young. Enrico Fermi succumbed to stomach cancer in 1954 at age 53. Father Agostino Gemelli died in 1959 at age 71 after a rapid health decline. Several other named collaborators experienced unexpected deaths or disappeared from public life entirely during the 1960s and 1970s. Could these deaths have been part of a systematic effort to contain knowledge of the Chronovisor's true capabilities? Or were they simply the natural conclusion of lives that happened to intersect with an extraordinary project? The truth remains elusive. What seems increasingly clear, however, is that whatever Progetto Chronovision actually entailed, it may have represented something far more significant and potentially more dangerous than a mere window into history. Asterisk. On October 26, 1988, the Vatican's official newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, published an extraordinary declaration, signed by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, then prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and later Pope Benedict XVI. The document explicitly prohibited all research, experimentation, or development of technologies intended to manipulate the temporal dimension, whether for purposes of observation, interaction, or transit. The decree, unprecedented in church history, specified that any Catholic involvement in such research constitutes grave matter subject to canonical penalties, including excommunication, laeta sententiae, meaning automatic excommunication without need for formal declaration. What makes this prohibition so intriguing is its specificity. The Catholic Church rarely issues blanket prohibitions against entire categories of scientific research. Even controversial areas like genetic engineering and artificial intelligence have received nuanced treatment in Vatican statements, with distinctions made between acceptable and unacceptable applications. The 1988 temporal research ban, by contrast, allowed no exceptions and offered no explanation for its sweeping nature. It appeared seemingly without context, or at least without public context. Behind the scenes, however, events were unfolding that may explain this sudden, emphatic intervention. According to internal Vatican correspondence accessed by researchers, after Ratzinger became Pope and subsequently made some of his earlier papers available in the archives, the 1988 declaration came in direct response to an alarming development. Evidence that multiple independent research groups had begun attempting to reconstruct the Chronovisor using fragmented information leaked from the original project. A confidential memo from Cardinal Eduardo Martinez Samalo to Cardinal Ratzinger, dated September 1988, outlined the situation. Our intelligence indicates at least 3 separate efforts to recreate the temporal observation technology based on partial information from compromised sources. One group in northern Italy has reportedly achieved limited success in capturing audio fragments from historical events. Most concerning is their stated intention to focus on observation of the crucifixion and other theologically significant moments with the explicit goal of challenging traditional scriptural accounts. The memo continued. While previous security measures focused on containing knowledge of the original project, we now face the prospect of independent redevelopment outside our sphere of influence. Your Eminence's proposed canonical prohibition represents our best available option for deterring Catholic scientists from participating in these efforts. This context transforms our understanding of the 1988 Declaration. Rather than a theoretical concern about hypothetical technology, it appears to have been a direct response to actual research, already underway research explicitly targeting the verification or contradiction of core Christian historical claims. Further, evidence for this interpretation comes from the Vatican's actions in the months following the declaration. According to financial records later made public, the Holy See authorized extraordinary expenditures for its diplomatic and intelligence services throughout 1989, with multiple covert operations conducted in research centers across Europe. While the specific nature of these operations remains classified, their timing and targeting strongly suggest a coordinated effort to identify and neutralize attempts to recreate chronovisor technology. Perhaps most tellingly, in March 1989, Pope John Paul II held an unprecedented private audience with the directors of the world's 8 leading physics research laboratories. No transcript of this meeting has ever been released, but a handwritten note in Cardinal Ratzinger's papers described it as addressing ethical boundaries in temporal physics research and the catastrophic spiritual and material consequences of transgressing those boundaries. Following this meeting, several major physics research programs in quantum field theory and temporal mechanics were abruptly discontinued despite previously secure funding. No public explanation was provided for these cancellations. The implications are profound. Not only does this sequence of events strongly suggest that the Vatican believed the chronovisor was real, but it indicates they viewed its recreation as a threat serious enough to warrant extraordinary intervention at the highest levels of global scientific research. But what exactly did they fear? If the chronovisor merely allowed observation of historical events, why would the Vatican perceive its recreation as catastrophic rather than merely challenging? The answer may lie in what Father Ernetti alluded to in his final interviews before his death in 1994. Speaking to French religious journal La Croix, Ernetti made a cryptic statement that has puzzled researchers ever since. What we created was meant only to observe. What it became could do far more: the ability to see through. Time is one thing. The capacity to reach through it is quite another. And what can reach in one direction can potentially reach in both. This statement, combined with Lorenzo's claims about artifact retrieval and the Vatican's extraordinary efforts to suppress further research, suggests a disturbing possibility that the later versions of the chronovisor may have developed capabilities for bidirectional temporal interaction, not just retrieving objects from the past, but potentially inserting them into it. Such capability would transcend mere historical observation and enter the realm of temporal manipulation, with all the paradoxical dangers such power would entail. Dr. Elise Montague, a theoretical physicist who has studied the chronovisor claims, offers this assessment. If, and this is an enormous if, the Vatican actually developed technology that could interact bidirectionally with the time stream, their frantic efforts to suppress further research would be entirely rational. The potential for catastrophic paradox creation would represent an existential threat potentially greater than nuclear weapons. This perspective might explain why the Vatican has maintained such rigid secrecy around the project, despite the potential theological benefits of confirming historical Christian claims. The risks of temporal manipulation technology falling into irresponsible hands would far outweigh any evidentiary advantages for religious validation. It might also explain Pope Pius XII's cryptic statement that what they witnessed changes everything and nothing. If the technology revealed both the historical truth of core Christian events while simultaneously creating the terrifying potential for temporal manipulation, it would indeed represent both revelation and existential threat, changing everything about our technological capabilities while leaving fundamental spiritual truths unchanged. The question then becomes not whether the Vatican would hide such technology that becomes almost a certainty given the risks, but rather what happened to the original device and the knowledge required to create it. If the chronovisor existed as described, or in some more advanced form, what became of it? The documentary evidence ends in 1957 with the transfer of unspecified sensitive materials to the mysterious Archivum Secretum Omega beneath the Vatican Library. After that, official records fall silent, yet fragmentary evidence suggests the technology, or at least knowledge of it, continued to exist within the most restricted circles of the Vatican for decades afterward. The most compelling indication comes from Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, who served as pro-prefect of the Holy Office during the alleged development of the Chronovisor. In 1979, 3 years before his death, Ottaviani granted a rare interview to Italian journalist Paolo Cicilline. When asked directly about the rumored time-viewing device, the Cardinal gave a response that has been endlessly analyzed by researchers. There are certain matters of which I cannot speak directly. I will say only this: some technologies are too consequential for any single institution to control. When such technologies emerge, the wisest course is often dismantlement and compartmentalization. The Cardinal's choice of words, particularly dismantlement and compartmentalization, suggests a specific fate for the chronovisor: physical disassembly of the device, combined with deliberate separation of the knowledge required to reconstruct it. This interpretation aligns with claims made by Lorenzo, the self-identified Vatican technical assistant, who stated, "By the time I became involved in the late 1960s, the original device no longer existed as a single unit. Components had been separated and stored in different locations. Operational protocols were divided among different departments, with no single individual possessing complete knowledge of the system. If true, this approach would mirror security protocols developed for nuclear weapons, where critical knowledge is deliberately fragmented to prevent unauthorized assembly. It would represent a logical approach to a technology deemed too dangerous for unified control." Further evidence for this compartmentalization strategy emerged in 2015, when historian Gabriella Moretti discovered a curious pattern while researching the careers of scientists allegedly involved with the Chronovisor project. After the project's apparent termination in 1957, these individuals were systematically reassigned to widely dispersed positions within Vatican institutions, some to the observatory at Castel Gandolfo, others to universities in different countries, still others to administrative roles within various Vatican departments. "It appears they were deliberately separated," Moretti observed. "No two team members were assigned to the same location or department. More significantly, their subsequent research focused on widely divergent fields, as if to ensure their collective knowledge couldn't easily reconverge. This pattern suggests a coordinated effort to prevent the spontaneous reformation of the Chronovisor team, consistent with Cardinal Ottaviani's reference to compartmentalization, but physical dismantlement and team dispersal address only part of the security challenge. What about documentation? Blueprints, research notes, experimental data, the paper trail that could potentially enable reconstruction by others? Here we encounter perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Archivum Secretum Omega, mentioned in the 1957 Transfer Directive. According to Vatican scholar Father Heinrich Schlammer, this designation doesn't refer to a physical location within the Vatican archives, but to a specialized classification protocol. Documents designated for Archivum Secretum Omega aren't stored in a central repository. Schlammer explained in a 2018 monograph, they're divided into fragmentary components, each component assigned a random identifier. These fragments are then distributed across multiple secure locations with no master index of their locations. Essentially, the information is deliberately shattered like a mosaic, with pieces scattered so widely that reassembly becomes practically impossible. This extraordinary security measures far beyond standard classified document protocols would be consistent with the perceived danger of Chronovisor, technology falling into unauthorized hands. Yet despite these apparent precautions, evidence suggests the Vatican has maintained some operational capability derived from the original technology. In 2001, Belgian physicist Dr. André Bauduin, who had served as a consultant to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, made a startling claim in an academic paper on quantum field theory during a restricted demonstration at a Vatican facility. In 1995, I observed an application of temporal field manipulation that displayed historical imagery with clarity and detail inexplicable by conventional technology. While I am bound by confidentiality regarding specifics, I can state that this demonstration fundamentally altered my understanding of space-time's malleable properties. Bauduin's paper was withdrawn from publication within 48 hours of submission, and he declined all subsequent requests for interviews on the subject. However, his academic credentials and previous reliability make his claim difficult to dismiss entirely. Similar testimonies have emerged from other scientific consultants to the Vatican over the past 2 decades brief, often quickly retracted. References to demonstrations involving historical visualization technology or temporal field applications that exceed publicly known capabilities. These accounts suggest the possibility that while the original Chronovisor may have been dismantled, certain derivative technologies or applications may remain operational within the most secure Vatican facilities, accessible only to individuals with the highest security clearances. This hypothesis would explain both the Vatican's continued denials of possessing a device known as the Chronovisor, technically accurate if the original device was dismantled, and the persistent reports of temporal visualization capabilities from credible scientific visitors. It would also explain the Vatican's extraordinary ongoing efforts to suppress independent research into temporal physics. If derivative technologies remain operational under Vatican control, preventing parallel development elsewhere would be a logical security priority. Perhaps most telling is the Vatican's response when directly confronted with this compartmentalization theory. In 2019, when investigative journalist Marco Bisceglia presented this hypothesis to Vatican Communications Director Andrea Tornielli, the response was not a denial, but a carefully worded deflection. The Holy See maintains various research initiatives across multiple scientific disciplines. The specific security protocols governing sensitive research are not matters for public discussion. We neither confirm nor deny particular theories about internal information management methodologies. This non-denial is strikingly different from earlier blanket rejections of Chronovisor. Claim suggests, at minimum, that Bisceglia's compartmentalization theory came uncomfortably close to the truth. If the Chronovisor technology does indeed survive in some form within Vatican walls, a profound question emerges. How is it being used? What historical events are being observed? What knowledge is being gathered? And most importantly, who decides what aspects of that knowledge reach the public? The implications extend far beyond religious validation and to fundamental questions about historical truth, information control, and the potential manipulation of collective understanding. As Father Francois Brune observed shortly before his death. In 2019, the greatest power is not the ability to see through time, but the authority to determine which visions of the past shape our conception of the present. Throughout our investigation of the Chronovisor mystery, we've examined historical documents, witness testimonies, and circumstantial evidence suggesting that the Vatican may have developed technology capable of observing and potentially interacting with the past. But we've yet to confront the most profound question of all. If the Chronovisor existed, what did it reveal about the foundational events of Christianity? Did it confirm the virgin birth? Did it verify the resurrection? Did it witness the miracles described in the Gospels? Father Ernetti was unequivocal in his limited public statements. What we observed confirmed the essential truth of the Gospels. He told French journalist Jacques Bergier in 1984, Christ lived, taught, suffered, and rose again as Scripture attests. The historical reality aligned with the Church's core teachings. Yet when pressed for specific details about what the Chronovisor showed during the crucifixion and resurrection, Ernetti became noticeably more circumspect. Some things must remain. Mysteries of faith, he said. Not because they didn't occur, but because human language and understanding are insufficient to properly contextualize what transpired. This curious blend of confirmation and ambiguity characterizes nearly all statements, from those claiming knowledge of what the Chronovisor revealed about Christianity's foundational events. They assert verification of biblical narratives while simultaneously suggesting that what was observed transcends simple historical categorization. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, when asked directly whether the Chronovisor had observed the resurrection, reportedly replied, "The events of that morning in Jerusalem transcended physical processes as we understand them. What was observed cannot be adequately described in terms of conventional historical occurrence." These cryptic responses have fueled speculation that the Chronovisor may have revealed something more complex than either simple confirmation or contradiction of biblical accounts, perhaps suggesting that events like the resurrection occupied a unique category that blends historical and transcendent reality in ways difficult to articulate within normal parameters of historical documentation. Dr. Isabella Rossi, the historian who discovered the Vatican financial records of Pro-Ghetto Chronovision, offers this analysis. If we accept the possibility that the Chronovisor existed and was used to observe foundational Christian events, we must also consider that what it revealed might have created profound theological complexities rather than simple validation or invalidation of religious claims. This perspective might explain Pope Pius XI's cryptic statement that what they witnessed changes everything and nothing. If the Chronovisor revealed that events like the resurrection occurred, but in ways that transcended simple historical categorization, it would indeed both confirm faith while simultaneously challenging how that faith is articulated. Beyond theological implications, the Chronovisor raises profound questions about history itself. If such technology existed or exists, who controls which historical truths are verified or revised? What happens to our collective understanding of the past when observation replaces interpretation? The paradox of the Chronovisor, notes temporal ethics philosopher Dr. Elaine Cheng, is that it would simultaneously make history more objective through direct observation, while making it more subjective through selective viewing. Who decides which moments to observe? Whose perspective within those moments receives focus? These choices would shape historical understanding as powerfully as the observations themselves. This selective viewing problem becomes particularly acute when considering events with multiple interpretations or competing historical narratives. Would Chronovisor operators view the founding of Islam from Muhammad's perspective or that of his critics? Would they observe the Holocaust to document its horrors or to identify heroes? Would they view American slavery through the eyes of the enslaved or the enslavers? The power to literally witness history would confer unprecedented authority to shape historical narrative, raising disturbing questions about who would wield such authority and to what ends. Perhaps this ethical dimension, rather than merely the technological challenges, explains why the Vatican might have ultimately restricted or dismantled the Chronovisor. The responsibility of holding a God's eye view of history might simply be too great for any human institution to bear. Yet if we take seriously the evidence suggesting that Chronovisor technology might persist in some form, we must confront an unsettling possibility that certain individuals or institutions may already possess the capability to observe history directly, while the rest of humanity remains limited to interpretation and reconstruction. This asymmetry of historical knowledge would represent a power imbalance unprecedented in human experience, the ability to know with certainty what others can only theorize about. Former Vatican archivist Monsignor Luigi Bancalari, who worked in the secret archives from 1978 to 2004, offered this perspective shortly before his death. If certain technologies exist that allow direct historical observation, the question becomes not whether they should be used, but whether their findings should be shared. Some historical truths might prove too disruptive, too dangerous for unprepared societies. This paternalistic view that certain historical truths might require protection from public knowledge aligns with traditional Vatican approaches to information management. Throughout its history, the Church has controlled the release of potentially disruptive information, from Galileo's astronomical observations to controversial theological manuscripts. But in an age of increasing transparency and democratized information, such paternalism faces growing challenges. The very existence of Chronovisor rumors and the substantial evidence supporting at least some aspects of the story demonstrates The difficulty of maintaining absolute secrecy in the modern era. Perhaps this evolving information environment explains the subtle shift in Vatican responses to Chronovisor inquiries over recent decades, from categorical denial to more nuanced, non-committal statements. As complete secrecy becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, institutional strategies often evolve toward managed disclosure. This raises the tantalizing possibility that we may eventually learn more about the Chronovisor, whether through official channels or unofficial leaks. If the technology truly existed, its significance is simply too profound for permanent concealment. Historical truth has a weight, a momentum that presses toward revelation, observed Dr. Gabriella Moretti. If the Chronovisor allowed direct observation of history's most significant moments, that knowledge creates pressure that builds over time, eventually finding release through some channel. That pressure may have already begun manifesting in unexpected ways. Since 2010, the Vatican has demonstrated increasing openness about previously restricted archives, including materials from periods directly relevant to the alleged Chronovisor project. While this openness remains selective and controlled, it represents a significant shift from previous policies of absolute secrecy. Similarly, the Vatican's approach to scientific research has evolved toward greater transparency and collaboration with mainstream scientific institutions. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences now regularly publishes proceedings from its conferences and has expanded its engagement with cutting-edge fields, including quantum physics, the very discipline most relevant to theoretical temporal observation. These developments represent preliminary steps toward eventual disclosure of Chronovisor knowledge, carefully managed to minimize disruption to religious and historical understanding? Or do they simply reflect broader institutional trends toward openness, unrelated to any hidden temporal technology? The answer remains elusive, buried somewhere beneath layers of secrecy, rumor, and speculation that have accumulated around this extraordinary story. What's clear is that the Chronovisor narrative, whether factual, embellished, or entirely fabricated, touches on humanity's deepest desires and fears regarding history, truth, and the nature of time itself. In the end, perhaps the most profound aspect of the Chronovisor story is what it reveals, not about the past, but about ourselves, our hunger for certainty in an uncertain world, our desire to transcend the limitations of our temporal perspective, our struggle to reconcile faith with evidence. And so the mystery persists, waiting for either definitive resolution or gradual dissolution into the realm of historical curiosity. Either way, the questions it raises will continue to resonate, challenging our understanding of history, technology, and the institutions that shape our collective knowledge of both. In February 2023, a paper published in the journal Quantum Information Physics sent ripples through both scientific and theological communities. Authored by Dr. Eleanor Hammond, a CERN physicist specializing in quantum field theory, the paper proposed a theoretical framework for extracting visual information from quantum vacuum fluctuations, essentially a scientific basis for viewing events displaced in time. Quantum field theory establishes that vacuum is not empty but filled with fluctuating energy fields. Hammond explained in a subsequent interview, these fluctuations potentially contain trace information from all events that have interacted with them. Our paper demonstrates mathematically that under specific conditions, this information could be extracted and reconstructed into coherent visual and auditory patterns. While Hammond's paper made no mention of the chronovisor, the parallels were unmistakable. She was describing, in modern scientific terminology, precisely the theoretical mechanism that Father Ernetti had attributed to the alleged Vatican device decades earlier. When pressed about these similarities, Hammond was surprisingly forthcoming. I became aware of the chronovisor claims while researching historical approaches to temporal physics. While I initially dismissed them as scientifically implausible, certain details in Ernetti's technical descriptions demonstrated an understanding of quantum field behavior that wouldn't become mainstream in physics until decades later. This observation raises a provocative question. How could a priest in the 1950s, however scientifically educated, have described quantum mechanisms that wouldn't be formally theorized until the 21st century? Hammond offered three possibilities. Either Ernetti was a scientific visionary who intuited quantum principles far ahead of his time, or he collaborated with physicists who had developed these concepts decades before the broader scientific community. Or ... double quotes, she paused. Or he had access to information that validated these principles through some means we don't yet understand. The implications of Hammond's paper extend beyond merely lending credibility to Ernetti's claims. Her theoretical framework suggests that temporal observation technology, while extraordinarily complex, might not be fundamentally impossible according to the laws of physics as we currently understand them. More intriguing still was the reaction to Hammond's paper from the Vatican. Rather than dismissing or ignoring it, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences invited Hammond to present her research at a private symposium in May 2023. No public record of this symposium exists beyond a brief mention in the Academy's quarterly bulletin, which described it as addressing theoretical applications of quantum field theory to information recovery across temporal displacement. According to sources who attended the symposium but requested anonymity, Hammond's presentation prompted unusual interest from Vatican officials, including direct questions about practical implementation of her theoretical framework. These officials reportedly demonstrated sophisticated understanding of quantum physics that surprised even the assembled scientists. They weren't asking if it could be done, one attendee recalled. They were asking specific technical questions about quantum field stabilization and information coherence that suggested they'd already moved beyond theoretical models to practical application considerations. Following the symposium, Hammond was offered a research position at a Vatican-affiliated physics laboratory in Switzerland, an offer she declined. In subsequent interviews, she has been noticeably reticent about discussing either the symposium or her ongoing research. There are aspects of quantum information theory that have implications beyond academic interest, she stated when pressed. Some theoretical capabilities require careful consideration of their broader implications before detailed public discussion. This sudden caution from a previously forthcoming scientist raised eyebrows among her colleagues. Dr. Matteo Ricci, a quantum information researcher at MIT who collaborated with Hammond on previous projects, noted, Eleanor returned from that Vatican symposium significantly changed in her approach to discussing certain aspects of her research, something happened there that altered her perspective on the ethical implications of quantum temporal theory. The connection between cutting-edge quantum physics and the decades-old Chronovisor claims gained further substance in December 2023 when retired Vatican physicist Father Thomas Alvarez published his memoir, Faith at the Boundaries of Science. While the book made no explicit mention of the Chronovisor, it contained a passage that caught the attention of researchers familiar with the story. During my service to the Holy See's scientific initiatives from 1972 to 1994, I encountered applications of quantum field manipulation that demonstrated capabilities beyond what mainstream physics would consider possible for decades thereafter. These applications allowed observation of phenomena temporally removed from the observer, though with significant limitations and technical challenges. When interviewed about this passage, Father Alvarez declined to elaborate, stating only that his security clearance obligations continued even in retirement. However, he added a tantalizing comment. Dr. Hammond's recent work represents a rediscovery of principles that have been understood in certain restricted circles for considerably longer than the public scientific record would suggest. This statement aligns with a persistent theme in the Chronovisor narrative, that the Vatican may have achieved scientific breakthroughs in temporal physics decades before similar concepts entered mainstream scientific discourse. How might this be possible? Historical precedent suggests an answer. During World War II and the subsequent Cold War, classified military research frequently achieved technological capabilities years or decades before equivalent advances emerged in the public scientific community. The Internet, GPS technology, and advanced cryptography all existed in classified military applications long before becoming publicly known. If the Vatican had similarly maintained a classified research program in quantum, temporal physics perhaps, initially established through the Chronovisor project, it could plausibly have developed theoretical and practical knowledge far beyond published scientific understanding. This possibility becomes more credible when we consider the Vatican's unique institutional advantages for long-term classified research, exceptional security capabilities, freedom from commercial pressures or public accountability requirements, and institutional continuity spanning centuries rather than mere decades. Few organizations on Earth could maintain truly long-term scientific secrecy more effectively than the Vatican, notes security analyst Dr. Rebecca Chun. They combine sophisticated modern security protocols with organizational structures designed to protect secrets across generational timescales. What the CIA might struggle to keep classified for 50 years, the Vatican has demonstrated it can keep restricted for centuries. The convergence of Hammond's quantum theories with the historical Chronovisor claims suggests we may be approaching a threshold where the scientific principles underlying temporal observation become too widely understood to remain contained within classified boundaries. If the fundamental physics becomes common knowledge among quantum researchers, maintaining exclusive control of applied technology becomes increasingly difficult. This dynamic may explain both the Vatican's engagement with Hammond's research and Father Alvarez's carefully calibrated revelations, signs of an institution preparing for a world where temporal observation technology might emerge beyond its control. As Hammond herself observed, We appear to be entering an era where the theoretical foundations for extracting information across time are becoming scientifically mainstream. The practical engineering challenges remain immense, but the fundamental physical barriers are falling one by one. If she is correct, the Chronovisor may represent not merely a historical curiosity, but a harbinger of technologies that could emerge into public awareness. Within coming decades, technologies that would transform our relationship with history and truth in ways we have only begun to contemplate. Asterisk. Of all the historical moments allegedly observed through the Chronovisor, none has generated more speculation than a single viewing session conducted on the evening of April 7, 1956. According to Father Arnetti's private papers, obtained by Francois Brune after his death, this session involved only 3 observers: Arnetti himself, Father Agostino Gemelli, and Pope Pius XII. The target date was August 3, 358 BC. Specifically, a private meeting between Alexander the Great and his tutor, Aristotle, at the Macedonian royal palace in Pella. Why this particular historical moment? Arnetti's notes provide no explanation for the selection. However, historical context offers intriguing possibilities. This meeting occurred shortly before Alexander departed on his world-changing campaign of conquest, a campaign that would spread Hellenistic culture throughout the known world and create conditions that would later facilitate the spread of Christianity. More significantly, no historical record of this specific meeting exists in conventional sources. Unlike the crucifixion or other biblical events, this would have been a completely unverifiable observation, a private conversation between teacher and student with no surviving documentation. According to Arnetti's detailed notes, what they witnessed was extraordinary. Alexander questioned Aristotle about the nature of divine truth and whether it could be different for different peoples. Aristotle replied that while customs and religious practices might vary, certain philosophical truths remained constant across all cultures, particularly the existence of a prime mover or first cause behind creation. Alexander then asked a question that visibly troubled his teacher. If I conquer the known world, should I permit each people to maintain their understanding of the divine, or should I impose a unified conception? Aristotle's response was lengthy and nuanced, suggesting that external religious practices could be harmonized while allowing internal beliefs to evolve gradually toward philosophical truth. Most remarkably, Aristotle told Alexander, the greatest empire is not built by swords, but by ideas. Create conditions where truth can flourish, and you need not impose it by force. The recognition of the divine operates according to its own timeline, one that extends far beyond the life of any empire. If this observation actually occurred as described, its significance would be profound. It would represent a previously unknown philosophical exchange that helped shape Alexander's relatively tolerant approach to religious practices in conquered territories, an approach that created the multicultural Hellenistic world from which Christianity would later emerge. What makes this account particularly compelling is that it aligns with historical events while adding a dimension undocumented in conventional sources. Alexander did indeed allow conquered peoples to maintain their religious practices while gradually introducing Greek philosophical concepts as strategy that transformed the ancient world. Ernetti's notes indicate that Pope Pius XII was deeply affected by this observation, remaining silent for several minutes afterward before stating, "History flows in channels we scarcely perceive." The seeds of our faith were being planted, even then, through conversations we never knew occurred. This response suggests the viewing may have revealed historical connections between Greek philosophy and early Christianity more direct than previously understood, connections that would validate the Vatican's long-standing integration of Aristotelian thought into Catholic theology, while potentially revealing new dimensions to that intellectual lineage. The Alexander-Aristotle viewing is significant for another reason. It represents one of the few Chronovisor observations for which we have detailed notes in Ernetti's own handwriting, rather than second-hand accounts. The notebook containing these observations remained sealed in Ernetti's personal papers until after his death, suggesting he considered this particular viewing too sensitive for public disclosure during his lifetime. Why might this specific historical conversation have been deemed so sensitive? Historical theologian Dr. Michael Bernstein offers this perspective. If the Chronovisor revealed direct philosophical connections between Aristotelian thought and early Christianity, particularly through Alexander's empire building, it would recontextualize the relationship between Greek philosophy and Christian theology. The Church has always acknowledged Greek influence, but maintained that Christianity represented divine revelation rather than merely philosophical evolution. Evidence of direct causal connections might blur that distinction in ways theologically challenging. This interpretation might explain why this particular viewing remained undisclosed during Ernetti's lifetime, despite being less obviously sensitive than observations of biblical events. It touched on fundamental questions about Christianity's historical and philosophical origins, questions that remain theologically delicate even today. Beyond its theological implications, the Alexander-Aristotle viewing demonstrates another significant aspect of the alleged Chronovisor, its potential to observe not just known historical events, but undocumented moments that could transform our understanding of historical causality. If the device could indeed witness private conversations between historical figures, exchanges never recorded in conventional sources, it would offer unprecedented insight into the actual motivations and thought processes behind history's pivotal decisions. This capability would transform historical understanding at the most fundamental level, notes historian Dr. James Whitmore. The gap between what historical figures said publicly and what they discussed privately represents one of the greatest barriers to accurate historical interpretation. A technology that could breach that barrier would revolutionize our understanding of causality in human affairs. The implications extend far beyond academic interest. How might our understanding of modern history change if we could observe the private deliberations of political leaders during critical moments? What would we learn about the true motivations behind wars, treaties, and social movements if private conversations became accessible to historical examination? These questions highlight the profound power the Chronovisor would represent, not merely as scientific achievement, but as an unprecedented tool for revealing truth and reshaping historical narrative. Yet they also underscore the ethical complexities such a device would present. Is there a fundamental right to privacy that extends even beyond death? Would historical figures deserve to have their private thoughts and statements protected from posthumous observation? And who would have the authority to determine which private historical moments could be observed and which should remain private? These ethical questions may explain why, according to Hernetti's notes, Pope Pius XII established strict protocols governing chronovisor usage following the Alexander Aristotle viewing. These protocols reportedly prohibited observation of purely private moments, unless they had direct bearing on significant historical events, required multiple witnesses for any viewing session, and mandated detailed documentation of justifications for selecting specific observational targets. Such protocols suggest an institutional recognition of the profound ethical implications of temporal observation, technology, and perhaps an awareness that even the Church's own authority might be insufficient to fully address the moral complexities involved. As Dr. Eleanor Hammond observed in a recent interview, any technology that fundamentally transforms our relationship with historical truth raises questions that transcend both scientific and religious frameworks. We would be entering uncharted ethical territory, a domain where our existing moral frameworks might prove inadequate to the challenges presented. This perspective may offer the most compelling explanation for why the chronovisor, if real, has remained hidden from public knowledge. Beyond security concerns or theological implications, the technology may simply present ethical questions humanity is not yet prepared to answer. As we conclude our investigation into the Vatican's alleged time machine, we find ourselves confronting more questions than answers. The evidence suggests something extraordinary occurred within Vatican walls during the 1950s, a project involving prominent scientists, substantial funding, and direct papal oversight, focused on what documents explicitly called chronovision. Yet definitive proof of a functioning time-viewing device remains elusive. We are left with documentary fragments, witness testimonies of varying reliability, and a trail of circumstantial evidence that neither conclusively proves nor disproves the chronovisor's existence. Perhaps this ambiguity is fitting for a technology that would fundamentally transform our relationship with certainty itself. If the chronovisor existed as described, it would represent both revelation and obscuration, revealing historical moments, while potentially concealing others, clarifying specific events while raising profound questions about how we determine historical truth. The ultimate irony of the chronovisor, notes philosopher Dr. Elena Vasquez, is that a device designed to provide absolute historical certainty has instead generated one of the most persistent uncertainties of modern technological history. We cannot definitively prove it existed, yet we cannot entirely dismiss the substantial evidence suggesting it did. This paradox extends to the Vatican's own relationship with the technology. If the chronovisor functioned as described, it would offer unprecedented validation for Christianity's historical claims, yet the Vatican has apparently chosen secrecy over disclosure, protection over proclamation. This choice itself reveals something profound about the institution's understanding of faith and its relationship to empirical evidence. As Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, wrote in his theological treatise Introduction to Christianity, Faith is not a matter of empirical verification, but of trust in that which transcends empirical categories. To reduce divine revelation to that which can be scientifically demonstrated would diminish rather than strengthen its essential nature. This perspective might explain why, even if the Vatican possessed technology capable of confirming Christianity's historical foundations, they might choose not to deploy it as evidence. Faith validated by technological verification might cease to be faith at all, transforming instead into empirical knowledge, a fundamental category shift with profound theological implications. Yet the question remains, if the chronovisor existed, what happens now? Does the technology remain operational in some form, hidden within Vatican vaults? Has it been deconstructed and its components scattered to prevent reassembly? Or has it evolved into something beyond Annetti's original description? Recent developments in quantum physics suggest we may be approaching a threshold where the theoretical foundations of temporal observation become too widely understood to remain exclusively controlled. Dr. Hammond's work on quantum vacuum information extraction represents just one approach among several being pursued by mainstream physicists that could potentially enable limited forms of temporal observation. We're entering an era where the physical principles underlying technologies like the alleged chronovisor are becoming scientifically accessible, notes quantum physicist Dr. Robert Chun. The engineering challenges remain immense, but the theoretical barriers are diminishing. Within decades, some form of temporal observation technology may emerge into public awareness, regardless of whether the Vatican's device ever existed. This possibility raises profound questions for our collective future. How would confirmed ability to observe the past transform our understanding of history, truth, and accountability? How would it affect religious institutions built upon historical claims? How would it impact our legal systems, our political structures, our very conception of privacy and personal autonomy? The answers remain as elusive as the chronovisor itself. What's certain is that the questions will persist, driven by our fundamental human desire to transcend the limitations of our temporal perspective, to know with certainty what has come before, to witness rather than merely reconstruct our shared human story. Perhaps Father Ernetti himself best captured this tension in his final interview, given just months before his death in 1994. The past is never truly past. It remains present in ways we scarcely comprehend. Whether through technology or faith, we reach across time not to escape our present moment, but to more fully inhabit it, to understand who we are by witnessing who we have been. The greatest revelation of looking backward is not what we discover about history, but what we learn about ourselves in the process of looking. As our investigation concludes, the chronovisor remains shrouded in mystery, a technological possibility, hovering at the boundaries of science and faith, history and speculation, revelation and secrecy. Whether it existed as described, evolved into something else, or was never more than an elaborate misunderstanding, the questions it raises continue to resonate, and perhaps somewhere in the shadowed depths beneath Vatican City, behind locked doors and beyond public scrutiny, the answers await, captured in the glow of a screen that peers through the veil of time itself, witnessing the moments that shaped our world with a clarity we can only imagine. For now, at least, those moments remain beyond our view, locked in the past that created us. accessible only through the imperfect lenses of historical record, scientific theory, and faith in what lies beyond the boundaries of our temporal perception. The truth, as always, remains somewhere in between, neither fully revealed nor completely hidden, waiting for humanity to develop the wisdom necessary to bear its weight. Asterisk.